this is a square orientation, and I'm trying to turn it into a rectangle. So I have a couple of choices to decide. Unless you're working on a square, then it's no problem at all. But I have to determine, do I want to add like additional, like maybe I want more branch and more negative space, and that could look something like this to create my rectangle. Or, you know, maybe I want it to go the other way around where I have more on the top. So you can decide that, right? It doesn't matter how we do it. I think last time we had added like a little bit more to the top and a little bit more to the bottom, which is probably what I'll do today, because I don't want all that negative space. Or you could even cut off some of the branch, which I don't really recommend. But instead of doing this, we could leave the image exactly the way it is, and we could just do something like that. You see what I mean? How we turned it into a rectangle where we just have that, but then I don't have any of the curve of the branch, and that's kind of what makes it special. But I think for me, I'm going to do what I said the second time. I'm going to add a little bit more height here. Now, Carol almost always works on 6x6s, which is, you know, great. I have a bunch of 5x7s, so I have to make all of mine rectangular. So I'm going to do that. And so in doing so, I'm going to have to raise it up, and actually this will come a little bit higher to be completely proportionate. Something like that. Okay. Now, looking at the shapes, but more importantly, let's zoom in and look at colors first. So let me get this out of the way so I can stop having so much brightness on there. Let me zoom this down so that we can really look at the bird. I want to try and get rid of that light though. Turn it the other way. Okay, that helps somewhat. Okay, so looking at the colors of the bird and considering my palette here, got a good bit of white because I see a good bit of white in the bird. But when I'm looking at the other colors, trying to determine what I'm doing here, you know, I'm trying to think, how would I mix this color based on what I'm using? Now, reminding myself that I am using, it doesn't matter, but I'm using the Golden Heavy Body. I'm using titanium white. I'm using primary yellow. I'm using a yellow ochre. I'm using a quinacridone magenta. And I'm using a phthalo blue green shade. There's also red shade, but I'm using green shade. And then there is bone black. And you can use like a Payne's gray or something too. But generally when I'm putting these colors down, I'll also do them in that order, light to dark. So that way I'm training my brain to move from lightest to darkest down the palette. So I'm laying down my colors, and when I'm looking at the image, trying to determine, you know, what I'm going to use color-wise. So how would I go about making this background based on those colors? Well, obviously it's got phthalo. We know phthalo is a super powerful color, so we want to just be really light with it. And by doing so, it's just going to be a small touch of that, and then a lot of bright yellow and a lot of white to kind of lighten that up to that teal color. And the same thing within the bird. There's small parts of like a viridian color, but really it's just going to be the phthalo mixed with the bright white, and that's how we're going to get it. But when I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about how intense the phthalo is, there's really not a lot of it in this painting, so there's not a need to put a ton of it down. The same thing with the quinacridone. It's a strong color, but there's not a lot of red in this painting, so there's no need to go, you know, super big. So here's mine, and I put them in order from white, and that's really too much quinacridone, but you know, that's what came out, but I just went kind of sparingly on all the others. But it'll help you over time to get a better acknowledgement of colors, so that when we play this out, this is whatever my background is. Are we going to be able to paint on top of the background? Yeah, you can, but you want the color to be peeking through. That's what all of this is. She had just stains it. She stains hers with a color and then wipes it off so that it's just a pale tint on the board. We're using acrylic, so we left the base coats down, so ours are more vibrant, more dark, etc. But they don't have to be, so totally up to you. Here, I already explained the colors for the background, and I'll move through the others, but for the most part, it's a lot of dark. This isn't a complex painting, so hopefully we'll be able to move through it pretty comfortably. We'll see. It's definitely no cut glass vase. So I'm going to put a panel here next to it. And let me just tilt this a little bit to get the computer out of the way. And then I'm reminding myself of my orientation. So I'm not going to put my palette in view right now because it's not really relevant to me as far as color, because I'm just using the ochre. So I'm going to create a soupy mixture with the ochre. And I'm going to try to get that in my palette. So we all know about making our soupy mixture, and with the brushes, you can use something a little bit smaller. I usually use this number 2. This is my number 2 Bristlon Bright. And so whatever your small rectangle is, I wet it a little bit, and then I will create a little bit of like a paste to be able to draw with. So I'm just bringing my ochre to the side so I can draw with it. Ochre is the easiest color to warm up or cool down, so it really helps me to be able to use it to draw with. Now for me, I'm going to, and it may not show up on this color, so I may have to darken it like we did the other day. But I am going to put a line across the bottom to indicate the extra that I added, because for me, it's just easier to go ahead and work on a square. So I'm turning this back into a square. So how do I know if it's a true square? All 4 sides are equal, so I could roughly measure to make sure that this side matches the other sides. You may or may not have to do this. I am going to mix a little bit of black into my ochre just so that I get it a little darker so that it shows up a little more, but not much. And it's still a watery color because this is just my drawing, so I'm not looking for it to be, you know, super dark. But I'm creating a square that I can work in so that I can keep it easier for my brain. I know that everything outside of these lines will be made up fictional background, so I'm not concerned with it. So for starters, I want to be able to take a look at this and measure my boundaries. Now, what do we mean when we're talking about our boundaries? Well, you'll hear me talk about quadrants a good bit. Quadrants are effective if I was to grid this, meaning that I divide it into 4 equal halves. So this would be quadrant 1, this would be quadrant 2, this would be 3, and this would be 4, is generally what I'm talking about. And so you can see almost the entire subject matter is in the 2 right quadrants. Now, we don't have to draw a grid on this. I usually don't. I'm just kind of explaining where I'm coming from when I'm coming up with this concept that I'm working on the grid method, but I'm teaching it more gesturally so that we can just measure. So I know that it's going to be on the right quadrants, but I need to determine if I was to take my brush until it hits the subject matter and say, well, what's it going to touch first? If I come from my north boundary, meaning that I drop the brush horizontally until it touches subject matter, boom, that's my north boundary. And so then I'll put a little indication, and that indication or mark falls in the upper right-hand quadrant. Does everybody understand that? So you don't have to do this yet. I'm just showing you where they are because we're going to talk about how to measure that too. Then our south boundary is going to come up from the bottom, same thing, until it touches the tail. Okay, so that's our southern boundary. Then we have a western boundary, and I'm not including the branch. And then we have an eastern boundary, which I'm going to include here. And hopefully it's clear to you that I just went until I touched the subject matter. When I touch the beak, I stop. I go from the east, and when I touch the side of the body, I stop. And there's my 4 boundaries that create the perimeter. And you can see almost everything's on the right side of the canvas. Now the branch is there, but that's, you know, not the subject matter. So that's not generally what I start with. I'm going to start with the star of the show. Now, if I was to contain this, meaning that I just connected the dots, this is kind of the geometric shape that I would end up with. Okay, and so it's not that that's super important, it's just that it gives me a visual to kind of see how the shape or the spotlight is encapsulated. And then I could break that big shape into smaller shapes. So within the I don't even want to call it a bird. Let's just say within the spotlight shape, what is the largest section? Okay. I see it as being this. I don't know if you agree with that. It doesn't matter because we all could see different things and we could take different paths to get to the same destination. So it doesn't matter. But for me, that's the largest shape that I see. Now there's different colors in it, but to me, that's the largest mass. Now I could treat this whole second shape as being this total head piece, and then I could treat this other as being a third piece here, right? So I'm going to erase these outer lines to keep from getting confused. But essentially, I took a shape that contained my bird and I divided it into 3 basic shapes, right? You see how simple that is on the side? 3 basic shapes. And now I can kind of measure those shapes among each other and see how they fit proportionately. Again, we're not doing this. I mean, you could be sketching it, that's fine, but I'm not expecting you to keep up with this speed. We're just breaking it down and talking to get started. Then I could take another piece. So it's like reducing fractions in math. If you were a math nerd, which obviously I was, then you can reduce the fractions into smaller pieces. So now we've got the head. How could we break that into smaller sections? Well, I see this white piece. I see this yellow piece. I see this red piece. I see this turquoise piece. You see what I mean? There's all these little pieces that now have made it more intricate, but we can just break them up like dividing up a section. Same thing with the body here. I've got this lighter piece and there's some strokes, right? But I could just draw these lines where the colors differentiate and it starts getting more complex. But the thing is, just like with the watercolor that we did yesterday, you come up with these landmarks that kind of keep you in the boundaries and it makes it less overwhelming. Then we can go in and add things like, you know, this branch or whatnot to create the shaping. Okay, so it sounds easy enough in theory. Let's see how it's applied. This is showing us how simple the shape can be, right? But I'm going to move it aside for now. Wipe it off. And we're going to try and measure out to see how that falls into place with our drawing here. Okay, so I need to determine where my north boundary is, and keeping in mind that I'm working from the top of the square, not the top of the paper, right? So I'm just measuring within this square, a square for a square. And so I can see the distance that this comes down as far as like, it's greater than the distance here, right? So with gesturing and also with the way I teach, there's some kind of guesswork that has to take place, and it's scary for some people, but you have to kind of guesstimate in order to get started and then measure after the fact. You don't have to, but that's the way that I teach, is that, you know, we kind of treat it a little bit looser so that we can get a starting point. So I'm going to measure, I'm going to eyeball the lower one. Why am I doing that? Because it's the smaller of the 2 spaces. So there's less guesswork. It's much greater for me to guess the distance here than it is here. So I'm going to come up here and say, well, I know that it's on the right half because we already talked about that. The entire bird is on the right half. So I pretty much can do this the entire time I'm drawing the bird. And I'm going to guess where my southern boundary is as far as the bottom of the tail. And I'm just guessing a small amount there. Now, where the measurement can take place is, if I want to, I generally would not do this myself, but I'm going to do it for you, that I would measure the distance between the bottom of the square and the bottom of the tail, and I would come up with that little segment. And I'd be willing to bet that it's 2 times this amount. So we can measure it to be sure, but that's what I'm assuming that that's going to be just from looking at it. So I can take my brush and I can move it until it hits the bottom of the tail, and then I can use my thumbnail to mark that space. And then once I have it, I can pull and say, it's not quite 2, but it's almost 2. And that's enough of a ballpark for me that if I needed to, I could measure this twice and do that. But I already told you I'm not like that, so I just look at it and I say, okay, that looks like 2 times that. And then I put it down, and that's my northern boundary. And the cool thing is we've got all this negative space that we've created, so we've got some wiggle room. But the more that you get into like pets or people or anything like that, these little millimeters of difference are going to be really crucial. Otherwise, it won't look like the object. And then I'm going to come up with my western boundary, or I could do the eastern, it doesn't matter, but I'm going to go with the western. Now, I remember from when I drew the grid that the beak was just beyond the halfway point, meaning that if I was to divide this exactly in half, the point of the beak goes a little bit further, but the smaller part of the beak is almost right there in the center. So again, if I was just to visually draw this in half, I know that that beak would come somewhere beyond the point of the center. So I'm just going to put a little mark there, and that's going to help me indicate where the end of the beak would be. And remember, all these marks are subject to change. So if we don't like them or we don't feel confident about our measurements, we've got the room and the time to change that. I could wager that the space between the top of the head and the top of the square would be the same or maybe a little bit bigger than the space from here to here. So once I have this measurement from here to here, then I can measure that and say, oh, I know it should probably be somewhere about from here to here. And I can just duplicate that, and that's going to give me my eastern boundary. And I think it's a little bit smaller, so I'm going to back it up just a little. Okay, and then if I choose to, I can create that geometric shape that we talked about, where I can tend to see like, oh, is this where I want my bird to be? You don't have to do this, but sometimes I just do it just to give us a point. And then proportionally, this should kind of be the dominant shape within the picture. And I have the choice to do things like, oh, do I want to bring the beak over just a little bit? And if so, that's going to change my shape just a little bit. No, it's no big deal. We're just drawing on the colored panel. No attachment, no fear, right? No fear. We're fearless. And that's why I love practicing her work with acrylic, because even though she doesn't use acrylic herself, it's so easy to amend that we can make alterations much easier. So now we have to break into 3 different sections. And just like we did initially, we're going to try and divide the piece into 3 shapes. Now, we can do this with measurements. If your inner voice is telling you that you need a measurement, then that means that you're probably going to be more precision based, and you may have to up it a little bit more than what I do. So just notice that. I'm trying to give you as many measurements as I can and still be true to myself. But I want to try and determine, and whether I use the transparency tool to do that, how I can break this body up into 3 identifiable shapes. So I already determined that one segment for me is this segment of the body. That's going to be what we'll call X, right? Then there's a segment for the head, and then there's a segment for the tail, whether that includes the branch or not, and we'll just go ahead and let it include the branch. Okay, so is that kind of clear for everybody? There's 3 segments that we're dealing with here. So I want to try and measure those segments and see, at best, this middle segment may be the same size, and it is, as the tail. So that helps because it's exactly halfway between here and here. But that still doesn't help give me a guiding post as far as where to start. So what I'm going to determine now, at best, I'm going to determine if this perhaps is half of these other shapes. So I can measure that to determine. And it's not, it's a little bit greater than half, but at least that's a good identifying factor for me. Now, I don't really have any other standard of measurement to go from, and that's okay. That means that I'm going to have to guess to get started, but at least I know where to go once I get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and guess where I think this head drops down. I know that it's lower than the beak, right? And if that's the beak, then I'm going to try and go for right here. Okay? Now, that's my guess. If that's true, then that means half of this is the tail and half of it's the body. And once I do that, I need to measure it to determine if this is a little less than half. And I can already tell that it's too big, that these are almost all three equal parts. So that's going to tell me that I need to shorten the head, which is going to raise the halfway mark. And then I'll try it again. Now I'm going to measure this to this, and that is a halfway point. And let me use some black here so that you can really see where my new marks are. These are the ones that I'm quote unquote going with. And this is why we use ochre, because you can go over it as many times as you need to, because this is a drawing phase. We're drawing. All right, so I'm measuring this to this, and they are the same. These are the same, half. And then I'm going to measure the head, and it is a little bit greater than halfway. So that helps me out. So I'm going to say, okay, that's the true deal for me. And now that I've got my mark, I can say, okay, that's the head. And then I can say, okay, this is going to be the body. And then this is going to be the tail, which includes the branch. And right now the body's looking a little squatty to me, like it needs to be longer, but I'm going to double check in a second and see, because it might just go slimmer. The bird might end up being smaller than I have it be. But right now we're just drawing, no stress. And then I'm going to work into breaking that head shape down so that I can determine where my drawing goes from there. Let's see. Let me measure this guy. Measuring the body, and body to tail is good. Measuring the head. And the head actually goes to the bottom of the branch, meaning that this segment here is two of them, but not to here, but down to here. So this will fit in here 1, 2 times and come up to the bottom of the branch. So that's going to be important to me for the purpose of when I measure this head here, and I say, well, there's one head, and then 2 heads. And this is where the bottom of my branch is going to be, right here. So that means that this whole part that he's sitting on is his branch. And I'm going to go ahead and just take it right off the side. And that helps with a little bit of the squattiness, because some of this body comes up into his throat, and then some of this goes down into the branch. Okay, now I'm going to narrow down the head, meaning that I can break it into several sections. So I have my little white piece down here that we talked about, right? But I see this slanted line from the beak. Now, just because this is a cone doesn't mean it is the beak. So I'm going to narrow in my beak a little bit. And the tool you can use to check this is, remember when we hold the brushes parallel to the angles? So this is parallel to the beak. I hold it steady and I move it over here, and then I can duplicate a line that's parallel to the beak. Notice the original line I had was way up here. Look at that angle. Is that the bird's beak? No, right? That was the line that connected between. So that helps me to double check myself, and I can just put in a little tilted angle. And then I can start curving that head up a little bit. Now I'm going to look for the bottom of the beak, and the same thing. I drew the line over to complete the head, but that's not the beak. The beak is a little bit more narrow, and because I went black, my lines are going to get a little bit more confusing. Lesson learned. And then I see, if I'm holding my brush here, do you see that it's almost like horizontal, but then there's an angle up. When it goes toward the eye, there's a diagonal that occurs upward a little bit. So I'll go up and then over. And that's going to create the shape for that yellowing section. And we've still got a long way to go, so we have plenty of corrections that we can make on it. I'm not worried about it. I do want to determine where I want to put the elbow. The elbow of the branch is where I consider to be the bend in the branch. A lot of people make them too curvy, and so I tend to accentuate them a little bit more. And we want to determine at what point it starts to go up. So what you can do, a trick for this, where you can measure, is that you can take your template, and if you were to pinpoint where that elbow happens, so I'm going to say the point of it is right here. So if I was to draw a line straight down, that's going to create a segment from here to here, correct? And we'll call that X. So that is a space that I can now measure, and I can measure it maybe to see if it's this shape and this shape are the same or whatever, but it gives me a guiding post where I can try and find a measurement. It could be half of this, it could be all of this, etc. But let's just measure and see if it's the same as the head. I put my brush to the top of the head, and then I mark the bottom of it, and then I turn it sideways, and oh, yep, it is. So what that tells me is, if I've already established my head as a constant here, then I can just measure the length of the head, and then I can turn that sideways, and that's going to tell me that the bend of the branch is going to occur somewhere around right here. And that gives me a good guiding post. So I know that it's parallel here, right? It's just a straight line until it gets out there. So I can just draw that over. And then I can work upward from that bend, okay? And then I see that there's another knob that comes up as far as a little branch that was cut off, so I can put that in there. And then come down and over to connect, remembering that it's just the beginning of our drawing. I can double check my angles, and I see that this needs to be altered a little bit to come in. This comes over. Of course, all that can be adjusted later as well. Tapering that in. But at least for the first time, I've got everything, down on the actual substrate, and then I can adjust as needed. Okay, so that's the layout. Now we're going to go in to actually try and fill in some of the bird. Now in doing so, let's see if I can tighten my space up a little bit here. Actually, I'm going to kind of center it in on the bird so we can see that a little more until we need something different. And I want to try to block in some of the values to kind of determine what's going on. So remember, it's shape, value, and color. So I'm asking myself at this point, is my shape correct? Well, I see some problems, but overall I've got something down on the canvas, and that's a good starting point. So I'm taking my number 6 brush. This is my number 6 flat, my silver brush, Bristolon. and I'm wetting the brush to get the fibers damp. And what I want to create is some value. Now, when I'm going in with black, even though there's a lot of dark in this bird, I don't want to go, really black really quick, but I do want to use some dark colors. So I've got my palette lined up in a spectra here so that I've got everything from the white down to the black, which you can't really see all of that, but there it is. And so I'm going to try and choose some of the phthalo blue because it's not quite as dark. And I'm going to bring it over and I'm going to put just a little bit of black in there just to make it darker. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the bird and I'm just going to feather in some dark spaces just to kind of get rid of some of that red. And it's just a real light, slappy layer. I'm not doing anything, over the top. I know that there is a red and a turquoise patch up here, but I'm disregarding those because they reside on top of this dark. And so for right now, I'm just trying to put some of the dark in to get that shape. Okay. Then I'm seeing a narrowing of the Kingfisher that comes in. And so I'm deepening that inner line. I made my body a little bit too plump. And so as I go to correct it, I'm going to darken that outer line and help narrow the perspective. I don't know what your truth is. Maybe yours is too plump. Maybe it's too skinny. But I'm bringing it down just a little bit, giving myself that wiggle room and just deepening the sides of it with that brush. And then, of course, the tail appears to be that dark. So I'm just going to go ahead and block out that imagery. I'm not worried about the two sections of the tail just yet. And then I can just I'm going to go ahead and just block out that branch too, just to help remind myself. So already the bird looks a little bit better as far as being more elongated, just by getting those slightly dark sections in. Then I want to move to a place where I'm starting to address the body. And the body is lots of dirty whites, and we're not going to call it white. We're not even going to attempt to do it white. When I'm looking at it, I'm looking at the darkest color within the body, and that's why I like studying her paintings, because she's so modular. And do you see these two darkest pieces? We have to figure out how are we going to mix that based on the colors that we have. Well, right off the bat, it looks more warm to me. Warm being that it looks like some of the ochre and some of the magenta. So I'm going to go ahead and mix some of those together. Now I'm noticing and remembering that the magenta is super strong and powerful. So the minute I start mixing it, I don't want it to overtake, because I still want it to be more on the ochre side than the magenta side, because that's what I see. Now that color, I'm comparing it. I'm like, you know what? That's really bright compared to that. So I'm going to have to add some kind of blue. Well, only blue I have is phthalo, and I know it's super powerful too. And the slightest overtap of it is going to kill the color. So I just want a little bit. And when I add it in here, I'm looking to see what's happening. And I say, okay, it's still a little bit too ochre, maybe a little bit too green. I can add a small touch of this quinacridone magenta to it and alter the color a little bit. And I'm just going to keep tweaking. I don't know what your truth is, because based on what colors you're pulling out, you're going to get something different. But I'm just going to keep going a little bit darker until I get something closer to that color. But every time I add something, I'm just asking myself mentally, does it look more red? Does it look more blue? Or does it look more ochre? And, eventually I'll get it to a place where, see, that looks a little more correct. It's still on the ochre side, but it's pretty close. It's always your primaries. This is just dominant with warm. So the two warm colors first, and then I started adding a little bit of blue to tint it down. Because overall, wouldn't you agree, this is more brown than more black? And when that's the truth, then if it's more brown, it means that your warm colors are more dominant in the mixture. And we know what our warm colors are, right? So stop and hold space for it for a minute. There's 3 primary colors with our kindergarten vocabulary, right? Yellow, red, blue, okay? So we gave these colors these fancy names, but essentially what's on the palette? Yellow, red, blue, black, white. And there's 2 yellows. So the only problem solving we really have to do is determining which yellow to use, right? Everything else is real simplified. That's why I was saying we could have just ditched the ochre, but because there's a lot of ochre in this painting, I didn't want to stress you out by mixing it, but we could have gotten away with just using the bright yellow and the quin and the phthalo, because the crimson's not as strong a color as the quin magenta, so it's fine, and you'll still mix the same, but you probably won't have to mix as much because, you know, these 2 colors are really powerful. I didn't give you these colors until later in the game. Remember, the phthalo replaced cerulean and the quin magenta replaced the crimson. And so, you know, once you learned the tinting strengths of these and you learned how powerful they were, then we started just giving you these instead. So, but the question that I'm asking you is that we're going back to this color and it looks more brown than black, correct? So with that being so, as soon as you look at a color, if it looks more warm or brown, then you know it's got more of the warm colors. Well, there's 3 primary colors. Yellow is warm or cool. It's warm. Red is warm or cool. It's warm. Blue is warm or cool. It's cool. Now, of course, you know, there are exceptions. I mean, there's cool, you know, reds and there's cool yellows, but we're not going down that rabbit hole right now. Basic vocabulary, warm, warm, cool. So when you're looking at this Kingfisher belly and you're saying, okay, that's brown, then you're telling me that's warm. If you were looking at the head up here, it's more black, so it's cool, correct? So then that's a good indicator when you're mixing your colors where the dominant proportions need to be. So you can play the tape and answer it for yourself. You look at the belly, you say it's more brown. What colors is it? It's got to be my warm colors. What proportions? Well, I don't know. Let's get started. So I'll put down some ochre because that's the darker of the warm. It's a dark belly, so why would I use a bright yellow? You know, that doesn't make sense. So I'm going to use my darker yellow. Then I'm going to use a little bit of the quinacridone, and I see that, okay, it's turning a little warm. Now I need to darken it. So I'm using a little bit of blue, but I know I can't use a lot of blue because if I do, it's going to turn more black and it's going to be more cool, right? See, there's borderline. I almost overdid it. But look at how the color compares. And if I was to swatch it, let me get a little card here. So I'm painting a little swatch of it on this card, and I can compare it. And that's pretty close, right? The Kingfisher is a little bit warmer, so I could add just a little bit more warmth here and get it where I need it to be. But overall, that was pretty spot on with that belly, right? So let's just hold space with this for a minute. And let's say that we were going to mix the head of the Kingfisher. And I'm hoping that you're paying attention because this is the question. So I've got a little bit of blue now, right? Same colors. I'm going to pull a little bit of the magenta in, and I'm going to pull a little bit of the ochre in, okay? And if I pull too much of the warm colors, let's just do that just for gigs, right? So it's starting to get kind of warm, but it's the same 3 colors, right? Why is this so different from this? It's the same 3 colors in both mixtures, right? It's because there's a higher proportion of the cooler color in this mixture because the head is more black. Does that make sense for everybody? So you're just really looking at your mixtures and the breakdown of that. I can put some of that up here in the head and it doesn't look any different than the black that I used when I mixed it with the phthalo. So, because really it's the same colors anyway. So back to the body, I'm going to put that in there. And I'm going to have to mix some more because it got dried out. And when I overdo it like I just did, then it's a pain in the butt because now I got to mix twice as much warm color to get it back where I need it to be. And that's where if I'm not paying attention and I put too much of these strong colors in there, I end up with a headache. But for right now, remember it's value. So as long as I can get a value that's close to it. You see how I've just kind of deepened that? Is it the right color? I don't know. Who cares? It's just, I'm just want to put a little bit of dark in there just to build my shape, because this whole thing could be wrong. I mean, his head could be wrong. I might have to slim the body more than I wagered, but I'm just trying to paint a shape within his body shape. And I'm saying, okay, this dark brown goes all the way to the edge of his body. Let me see how I can make that work for me. The layer is transparent. I can still see the red underneath. It's okay, who cares? I'm just laying it down. Now, because the value is lighter as it moves up, I can go ahead and add a touch of white if I feel inclined to do that. If it's oil, which I'm not going to go too far down there, but if it's oil, I would not be adding the white yet. I would just make the whole thing dark. But I can put the beginning of a swipe just to show how light that chest is. But I have to really remind myself that I'm not trying to finish the bird, because if I get locked down in trying to match these colors and put all these light shapes in there, I'll get lost. So I'm going to add just a little bit of lightness just to finish filling it in. And you see how already the body looks a little bit better? You know, it looked so squatty for so long. I kept telling myself, your drawing's wrong, your drawing's wrong. And, you know, it's still got some tweaks, but it's better than it was a minute ago. And look at how thin and raunchy these layers are, right? It's nothing life-changing. It's just a swatch to remind myself light and dark. Okay. Now I'm going to pull just a little bit of the, I'm going to clean my brush out, and I'm going to pull a little bit of the ochre. The brush doesn't have to be totally clean, because you can have some dirtiness for some other colors in there. And I'm going to fill in this throat or cheek section. I added just a little touch of white to it. I don't want to add too much white, because remember, I'm going for just value. I want the darker part of it. The only reason I added a little bit of white was to help make it stick so that I could see the background. Or could not see the background, I guess is the correct. And then when you feel like you've achieved that, you can just go back in for any dark. I'm just going to try and pull from this black and blue mixture that I started with for the bird's head. And I'm going to try and fill in my branch, the bottom of the branch. Now I know the branch is warm toward the top, but I'm not concerned with that at this time. I'm just trying to fill in the section. Come over a little bit. Shape, value, color. So we've drawn the shapes, we're adding in the value, and so you're just filling it in. During the block-in phase, you're going to be real tempted to fixate on color, and this is something that my 3 and 4 years are still mentally doing. And if you can release that and just keep retraining the brain just to go back to value, then you know, the learning curve is going to be steep in the beginning. You're going to carry it in too far directions a few times. And that's why acrylic is the most forgivable media, because you've got plenty of room to go back and correct it. And you'll get more efficient with time. And those of you that have been with me a minute, you know that you get better and better. Okay, y'all ready to move forward with some background to finish the block in? Okay, so I'm going to use, I'm going to just keep using this brush. I know I've got a lot of broad area, but the image is so small by the time I switch two brushes. One option is that I could use my larger brush here, but I'm worried about getting in between here. I know I could probably do it, but I'll just stick with this. So I'm going to try and get something in the ballpark of the color, but I do not want all this yellow, right? That's something that's going to be added. I know from other classes that I'm going to go in and brighten the background. So what I'm really going to try and get is this turquoise color that is real subtle that's in between. So the way that I'm going to go about mixing that is that I'm going to, first, I'm going to scrape this ochre off so that I have a little bit more leverage. Let's go ahead and scrape this off because it'll be dry by the time I get back to it anyway. Okay, and then I'm gonna wet my brush and I'm gonna pull it some phthalo over. And then I'm gonna pull a small touch of the yellow, and it should turn kind of a green color. Not too green if I pull too much of the yellow over. And then I'll pull some of the white, all right? And with those colors, let me alter my thing here so I can get a stronger, higher view. Sorry for the vertigo. Advance. Get more of that palette exposed. And this is a little bit too intense, so I can remind myself that I can go with just a little bit more of the white to lighten until I get something soft enough that, you know, it's identifiable with that. And you can always keep like an index card or something handy, and you can swipe it and then compare it to the color so that you can see. But, you know, just keep something so that you can do a color swatch comparison if that's what you want to do. Again, I'll just kind of eyeball it. So what I want to do is I want to come on the side of the panel, and I want to begin to put a couple of the strokes down just to get started. Now I don't want to cover all of my area, so I'm trying to make this a pretty lazy coat, just where I'm just kind of smacking down some of the value. And the only reason I'm picking mine up is because I don't want to get it on my image, but just kind of get these areas off to the side, leaving some peaks of my dark color come in between. Now, one thing that I know is that my body needs to be slimmer. So I can go ahead and cut down some of those angles while I'm doing this. So I'm creating an angle over. And then I've got the same thing on this side. I made it too rounded, so I'm gonna just tilt it down just a little bit. And then I'm also getting rid of that dark line where I had changed the beak. And then another thing that bothered me from the get-go is this angle on the back of the head. It's a little bit tilted down, so I'm going to use the background to cut off. This is why I didn't block in my background first. A lot of times we're taught to go from the back to the front, and that's true when it's resolving, but when I'm drawing, I'm going to make my adjustments by getting the back in. And then I'm going to kind of get the palette out of the way so we can focus on matching up the background here. There's some of the branch that I made a little bit too thick, so I can, again, use the background to taper off what I need, but I want to leave that elbow in because if I remove too much of it, then it'll start looking curved, and I'm not, I don't want that. Oops. And I'm just going for a real loose interpretation of all of this so that I can allow myself to cover the back. I'm mixing up some more color because I've just got a little bit, not enough to conceal. I'm just going to hold up the panel here to get rid of the glare. And I'm just putting a thin base coat. This is just enough to conceal the eye. If you overdo it and you cover up too much of your pink, you won't have any visible at the end. But if you don't cover enough, you may still get distracted. So when you're done, you should have a little bit more of an outline, something kind of like that, where you can alter the shape. I noticed that the tail is still a little wide for me too, so I can also use the background to make an adjustment there and tilt it in. It's more of this side that has to be removed. Okay, and then I'm going to take a pause here because that's the block in, and then we'll be able to come back for the finishing stages. Cloud. All right, so I'm going to go back in and I want to address the rest of the painting, the layers. So I'm going to tighten up this space so I have a little bit more room to work, and you can see the palette. And I'm going to go ahead and start really brightening up my background. Now there's some small incremental changes that I could make, but I want to go ahead and get the background resolved. So I'm pulling in more of my background here, and I'm going to go in and take a little bit of this yellow and a little bit of the blue. And I'm trying to mix up a good wad so I don't run out of paint. So this is getting a little bit more on the green side, which is fine by me. And I'm very quickly wanting to put in just another layer of color. And what this is going to do is really allow the dark spaces to pop out, especially going thick around the bird. Phthalo, bright yellow, and white. You gotta have it's still probably dominant with the white because I want it to be, you know, really attention getting, and I want the opacity of the white. But it's not the end all be all because I can still paint the bird on top of the background a little bit if there's misjudgments. But you see how much better it already looks, that it's really bringing in the shape of my bird and letting me make some corrections there. There's some proportional things that need to happen as far as the beak and the head and all that, but there are little things that I can paint on top of the background. I want the color to be close enough, not exact. I'm not doing all the lighting and the light yellow and all that nonsense. I'm just trying to get enough of this in here that there's some of the pink showing through in areas, but also that I can just take another look at any proportional things happening with my bird before I move on to the colors. Because if the shape's wrong, you know, I'm gonna have to go back and redo all of this anyway, and I don't want to do that. So time to take a look at it now. And by just skirting a little bit of white over this, you know, the highlighter pink is still kind of visible, but it's not as intense. It's not really meaning for some of that straight up fluorescent red to show through. I just wanted the glow of it to come through. Okay, so to me that's pretty effective. There's parts of it showing through, but none of it is straight intense, and it'll allow me to now look at some of my own shapings, and I'm going to make some of my own recommendations, you know, based on what I looked at there. I see, for example, if I were critiquing myself, that I cut this too far in, so the bird actually continues down on the branch because his foot comes over. And if I had to draw his foot in, I'm noticing that the foot, if I was to draw a straight line from the foot, look at how far over it is from the tail, right? So if his foot comes down, I'd have to have some body there to connect with it. Another thing for me, similar to the way I told a couple of y'all, I think my head can extend a little bit further back. I think when I cut off some, I cut off too much. And I think I can also lower the height of it down a little bit. And I think that'll help with the appearance as well. So I'll make some small adjustments like that. But right now, I think the top of his head is a little bit too angled, and it's changing the look of him. So I'll address that first because it's shape, value, and then color. So I'm just going to take some dark, and I want it to be a little warmer, so I don't want to just use black. So I'll just mix a little bit of ochre and a little bit of the quinacridone magenta with it. A little bit more black. And then you don't have to probably do this step, but I have to fill in some more of the body here. And I'm going to fill in some more of the head, which I am going to use black for. And I could probably even, now that I'm looking at it, taper down closer to the beak. So I'm going to take a little bit more background color. And what I mean is that I'm going to cut in toward the beak a little bit more here. And that helped out a lot. I don't want to overdo that. Okay, so everything else can be added to, so I'm not concerned. And now I want to go back in using my number 6, and I want to start putting a heavier layer of paint. So now the color's more important. If I'm telling myself that the background is more true, etc., I want to get more of a foundational layer on this bird chest so that there's not so much of the red glowing through. So I'm going back to mixing that brown. So I'm remembering the earlier mixture that it was warm. I considered it, I'm talking about this right here, I considered it to be a darker step. You may or may not have to revisit this step, but I'm going to mix a little bit darker brown color, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to put a second application to conceal more of the background color. So all the primaries, heavier with the warm. That was too much. If I need to plump out the body, or if I need to narrow the body, I can do that. Okay, and just that solidifying of the body makes it look a lot more correct to me. I see now for the first time that this throat that's connected to the yellow is a little bit wider. So I'm going in with the same color, but a smaller brush so that I could get in here and do it. And again, this may not be something you have to add, but it's an example of how I see adjustments. And I'm just gonna widen the throat a little bit. Okay. And once I feel like I've got a good coat on the body and I feel like it's where it needs to be, I could probably move towards using the smaller brush to put the strokes in here, just because the bird is so small on my canvas. So you pick a tool that's right for you. But I want to start going down and acknowledging the highlights and the tones of the body. So I'm starting with the larger section, which is the chest, and I'm using the same color. We just had the brown, so there's no difference. It's still the warm colors with a little bit of the blue, but I'll start adding white to it, just a little, and allowing it to get a little bit more light. And I see a little bit more of a quinacridone tint, especially like right here. There's a little bit more pink on it. Same colors, just different proportions. If you're confused about it, just ask yourself, is it a little more white? Is it a little more pink? And I'm just going to highlight. I'm looking at this bottom part of the body here, highlight, and I'm dragging the shape over. It's almost like an L shape. Do you see it? It comes down and over. See, little L shape. And then I see above the L shape, there's like another one, but it's a little bit more faint. It's not quite as dark. So I'm not even cleaning my brush. I'm just using the residue and blending straight in to that so that it gets more faded as it moves up toward the throat. And I'm just recreating all of those shapes. Even though it's brighter, I'm not trying to make it brighter. I'm trying to feel my way out through the shapes that are up here so that I can just make it opaque. The only parts that I'm not painting are the parts that I see that seem to still remain dark down there. And if I overdo it, it's okay too, because I can paint over that. I think color mixing in general is hard, and mixing your own brown and black are hard because they involve all three colors. But it's an exercise that you could always, keep working on. We did that color mixing in class, and it might have seemed kind of mundane, but if you really hold space and do that with all your colors, you'll get better at the mixing where you can just add a dash. That abandoned ship has become an important thing for me, because when I'm mixing colors, I make mistakes all the time, especially when there's powerful colors on the plate, because if I grab too much and I'm not conscious of the pressure and the amount that I'm getting, I can dominate the mixture in a heartbeat, and then I have to go and scrap all that. It's just part of the lesson, unfortunately. All right, so now I want to move, I'm going to move down into the branch for a moment. And again, at this point, you may have to revisit steps, you may not. But what I need to do is darken the base of the branch. So I'm taking just some of my black, and I just want to do the lower part of the branch. And if I'm doing this step, then I'm telling myself in my head that I'm happy with the shape of my branch. I'm saying that, this is going to be the bottom of the branch. If you're still working on the shape, then don't do this. But the lower part of the branch is darker, so I'm just glazing some of this black. It's not caked on. I'm just glazing it on there to make the bottom appear a little bit darker. but I have to get a good base layer down. And right now I still have a weak foundational coat because I can still see so much of that dark or that bright color coming through. So I'm taking a little bit more dark paint. And going over it just a little bit. And then I want to move to the upper portion of the branch. And what you'll probably notice when you're looking at the picture is that, you know, closer to the Kingfisher itself, the branch is a little bit lighter under his feet. But further away, the branch stays a little bit darker. So if you're mixing your brown, it's going to be the same colors, you're just getting different variations of brown. So you're going to mix your quinacridone, your ochre, and a little touch of that blue, but we're trying to get a warmer, you know, more inviting brown. And I'm just going to skirt across the top of this branch to try and highlight some of this. And I kind of overdid it. So I'm just going to take a wet brush and smooth it back out. I'm looking for good coverage, and I'm looking for a little bit of a highlight on that branch. That's my goal. I don't want it to get too chalky. And then the warmth I see, if you notice, the color right by his foot is the same color that's up in his chest. So we're going to try and mix that. Try and block this in just a little bit more. And I do see a little bit of this color up here. So I'm going to put it up here by the knot. And then I'm just going to add white, little bit of white. I'm adding to that color to try and lighten it up a little bit. And then I'm going to bring some ochre because my personal color is a little bit too rosy. So I'm going to try and offset it by bringing in some ochre. And that's the problem solving for me because our mixtures are all different. And then I'm just using the corner of the brush, or you can move in with a smaller brush. I don't really care. And I'm going to test drive on this branch first to see if I like the color and the highlight. And I'm just going to put a straight line across because I haven't done the foot yet. So it doesn't matter that the foot will overlap or cut into some of that. And I just put the highlight down. And then whether you change brushes or not, for you, I'd probably recommend going to the smaller brush and then coming in and putting a second layer on this throat so that some of these patches become brighter. And whether you duplicate her strokes exactly or whether you just put some of your own strokes in there. And I'm just using the corner of the brush to bring out the highlights in the throat. Now I see as it moves up to the second tier, it looks more yellow or more ochre to me. So I'm going to bring in a little bit of the yellows, both yellows, and a little bit of white to that same mixture. Again, you're going to have to make it personal to you because your mixture's different than mine. But I do know that if this was rose that I was using, the color next to it is a little bit more on the yellow side. And I'm going to put a couple of strokes up here at the top. And that turned out to be pretty good for me. And I'll just lighten it up. And then I'm just going a little bit brighter. I'm moving a little bit whiter as I move up, but it's still a dirty white, so it's stained with the other colors. And that's a big value jump. So I'm gonna go back and adjust the other colors. It's no problem that I did it, but it was a big jump too quick. And to me, it's too stark. And if I were critiquing myself, I'd say you need to marry those values down a little bit, which means that I'm either gonna have to darken the top one or brighten the one beneath it. And I'm gonna choose to brighten the one beneath it. And my paint's getting sticky, so I'm dipping it in the water to smooth it out a little bit more because the layer that I just put down isn't quite dry yet, so I have to be aware of that. And I'm just lightening a little bit beneath it. And I'm realizing that I was attached to the strokes I had down before. I like them better. So now I'm mourning the loss of my painting as the way it was. And the emotional cycle continues. It's true for me anyway. If I'm noticing that about myself, then I've already gotten too attached to the painting and I forgot that it was practice to begin with. And that's where like a lot of those, what's it going to look like when I post it? Or, or if I'm, a lot of times I'll get pressure for thinking about what am I going to do with all this now? Is somebody going to want to buy it? And is it good enough? And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. It's practice. Everybody, I don't really recommend gessoing over your paintings though, because it's good for you to do a series of them and look to see where the progression is. You'll be able to see how far you've come when you hold it in relation to some of the other ones. That's why when we have our classes, I have a lot of you do goals and I'll have you do like a series. If you're doing landscapes, I'll say, well, let's do 3 of them and let's look at how you evolved with your colors or your trees or whatever. So different strokes for different folks. So I'm lightening my values a little bit and I'm going back to just soften the edges because I don't want any stark marks. But I did lose some of the painterly effects, but I'm okay with it. I know that I can go back and tweak this, but it's more important for us to get all the steps in. So we're gonna move on. Just lighten the lights a little bit more. Now that I've done that, they don't stand out quite as much because I lightened all the values around it, so that feels good. All right, so I'm going to put one little highlight down here by the foot that's not there yet. The highlight is, the foot isn't. And now I want to move into the cheek area and I want to brighten it. So it already had some ochre and hopefully yours is pretty transparent at this point. But I'm going to take a little bit of ochre and I'm going to take a little bit of the primary yellow and I'm going to take a little bit of white. So the 2 yellows plus white. And I'm going to start on this left side of the cheek and lay an opaque, brighter section in that fades in to the other part. And this can be as bright as you need it to be. I'm going to go a little bit brighter. But every time I add white, I'm adding the yellow to it, so it'll stay nice and true. And it'll be different from the part I just laid down next to it. So now mine's a little bit more yellow. I'm just going to tickle the edges so that it fades in with the ochre behind it. And now I'm going to zoom in a little bit because we're going to have to work on these areas of the head. And even though you won't be able to see me mix the colors as much, I'm trying to do the teal. And there's a little bit of teal if you look right here on his shoulder. And there's a little bit of teal in the head. And then I'm going to mix that by doing some of the same background colors, but there's going to be less white. So I'm taking yellow and phthalo and mixing up something, and there's just a touch of white to make it stick. Meaning that when you put it down on top of that, because phthalo's a transparent color and yellow's a transparent color. And if you don't put a little bit of white, then it won't show up on top of that dark black. But if you put too much light, it's going to be too bright. We don't want that either. So what I'm going to do is put just a little bit of a tickle so that I have that little phthalo patch that is showing up in the corner. And then I've got a little bit here on the shoulder that I'm going to put in. And I'm just looking, I guess there's a little bit on this other shoulder too. Kind of blends in with the background. Okay, and then you may or may not have to do this, but for me, I have to go in and darken and shapen the tail. Meaning that first I've got to make another coat of it. So I'm taking some phthalo and some black, and I'm actually putting the tail in. And for the first time with this smaller brush, I'm allowing the curved shape to fold out a little bit. And I noticed that one side of the tail is longer than the other. Okay, and then I've got the shape of it by doing that. And then while I've got that same dark, I'm going to turn my brush sideways and I'm going to draw down the feet. And I'm just holding the brush sideways. I'm not pressing down. And I'm just drawing a mark. It's the dark part of the toe. I just need it to be there as a base layer. And I'm drawing it down. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other one. And it looks like, it almost looks like his toes are crossed or something. But I don't know what's happening and it doesn't matter, but I'm going to draw two to show that. And if for some reason I feel like I made it too big, I can always go in with the brush and remove, wetting the brush. And taking off a little bit. Now I'm going to come up and put a little bit of brightness on the head. And I'm talking about this red section above the eye. So I'm taking a little bit of the magenta and a little bit of the bright yellow, and I should get like a salmon color. And then again, a little touch of white, just like I did with the phthalo. And I'm going to come right where I believe the beak ends, and I'm going to put a little bit. And because they're both transparent colors also, I'm going to add a little bit white because that didn't show up worth a toot. So I'm adding a little bit of white to the mixture. And I'm going to try it again. That's better. I'm going to make it a little bit brighter by adding another layer. Yep, that's too bright. I knew I was going to do that. Soften it back down. I'm just going to glaze this down until I get it the way I want it. And it seems like I'm just digging a hole in it, so I'm just going to leave it for a second. Okay, and then the eye, there's two little spots. You're going to freak out about this eye, but I'm going to take a little bit of white. I'm taking my square brush, and here comes the eye. You ready? So here's my square brush. I'm turning it sideways. I don't have a lot of paint on the brush. It is, very thin and subdued, meaning that I've just got it real light. And I'm holding it down. I'm coming in to where I believe that the eye is, and I'm just tapping a little corner down. That's giving me a bright eye. Now that's a little bit too bright. So all I have to do is take either a paper towel or my finger and pat it down, and it'll soften it. I'll use my finger because that paper towel didn't work. And I guess that's already dry, so I'll just put a little dap of black around it. But I just want a really soft mark to show up. His eye's not really that strong. And then if you look underneath it, there's one other little lighter gray spot. And I'm going to do the same thing just to put a little bit of mark underneath it. And then of course the eye's brighter than the mark underneath it. So you're just going to have to play with that value till you can get it a little more subtle. But that's the eye. And the cool thing about this is that you can go back in with a darker color, like the black, and you can separate the two. So if it gets messy for you, you can just kind of put that black in there on top and it'll show up again. All right, then I'm going to take a dull blue. So you can dip into your phthalo and black mixture, or if you don't have one, just mix something up. And it should be phthalo, black, and white, but it should be a lot more black and white than phthalo. There's not much phthalo in it. And that's kind of the color that I'm going for, just a really grayed out phthalo. And what I'm going to do is turn the brush sideways, and I'm just going to skirt the top of this beak to highlight it. And if it doesn't show up, I want to add a little bit more white, but if you add too much white and it gets too bright, it's going to be so in your face that it's going to distract. And so I just want to kind of get a soft highlight. And there's two highlights on there. There's one that's, I guess, the top part of the beak, and one that's the bottom. And the bottom one goes almost to that red notch on the inside. But again, if it's too stark, then it might call my attention away from it, the rest of the bird. And then I also noticed down here on the foot that it's the same color. So while I've got that, I'm just going to highlight that toe. And I'll even put some over here. Although this color is not quite as bright, so I'm just going to hit it with the brush to knock it down a value. I'm highlighting this a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out for this a little bit so I can see it all in the context. Okay, and now I want to adjust my background again. So I've kind of hit everything. It doesn't have to be the end all be all. I can still tweak it a little bit, but I want to brighten my background a little bit. Now, if you take a quick look at my background, you see probably the biggest differentiation is not only the value, but also the tone of the yellow. So what I'd like to do is to brighten it with a little bit of yellow. Now, one problematic area for me was when I added this beak color, the blue of the beak and the area right above it were so close that it kind of makes it look weird. And that's why I'm going to go back with one final addressment with the background color. So I'm cleaning out my long number 6 brush. Okay. And I'm going in and mixing the same colors, but what I'm doing is, here, I'll just go on the clean side. What I'm doing is I want to mix something that's a little bit more yellow, more bright, closer to the color there that I see. So I'm still taking my phthalo, but look at like how little, I mean, there's like hardly anything on this brush. That's the phthalo that I'm using, that little bit of residue. That's perfect. It's great. More than enough. And then I'm going to take my yellow and mix it in, and I'll get something really high key, right? It's like, oh my gosh, that's in your face. And you see how much that little bit of phthalo stained it, right? Then I'm going to come in with some of my white, and I'm just going to start off the pile. You see how bright and intense that color is? I'm not even mixing in the middle of it. I'm coming off to the side, and look, I mean, that's kind of it. If I had mixed in all that, then it probably would have been too dark, and I would have had to keep adding white. So I'm trying to reserve paint. And even then, I could still go a little bit more on the bright yellow side. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put a little more of just the primary yellow on this side, so that I end up with 3 mixtures. I've got one that's more green, one that's more yellow, and one that's more white. And when I'm looking at this, I'm seeing that, you know, man, I mean, there is a lot of yellow colors in it. But I'm guessing that this is going to be pretty in your face bright. So I'm going to start closest to the bird. So I want to just put down areas that are brighter and almost creating like a little outline around the bird. And I don't want to do too much because this has a quick dry time. So once it sets, I'm not going to be able to soften the lines as much anymore. So I'm just going to do part of this outline here. And then I'm going to soften off the edges. So I've got the brush down. And what you may want to do is have a chaser brush. So for example, I've got the paint here and I don't want to keep washing my brush and reapplying. So I'm just going to set that brush aside. And I'm bringing in a totally other brush, you know, something that I can blend the edges with. And it's just a wet, clean brush. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull away from that item to soften it. And I'm having to use my non-dominant hand to keep the angle of it. And see, already that's dry for me. So I'm going to put down more paint. Try and work a little bit quicker. And then I'm softening the edges, you see? Okay, and you can do this as many times as necessary to get it brighter. Maybe you want a ton of bright. Maybe you want it to extend a lot further. But the point is, we only want the whiter parts closer to the birds. So I'm going to do this real fast throughout. Bringing in a little bit more of the green. And then I've got my chaser brush. I'm just softening it out. And then I'll just keep expanding. I want to have this, I'm gonna have to work it a little bit faster because my dry time. If you have a big mixture, then your paint won't dry out before you get it down on the canvas. But also I'm letting some of these strokes be like final strokes. I don't want to do a lot of over blending. So I want some colors to appear more yellow, some strokes will be more teal. So by doing this, I can create a brightness around all the areas, but I can let some of it fade out to a different color so I don't end up with this lemony bright background. You know, I've got some parts that are aqua, some parts that are yellow. Some of that original neon red is still showing through for me. I've got a secondary color here. I'm going to bring in a little more yellow and a little more white. And I'm keeping my brush pretty fluid so that I can blend this. I'm just going to hold it so I can do it a better job. Keeping my edges sharp because that's what's going to make it look crisp. And then when I'm pulling these colors, I'm going to get some more of the greens and turquoises in there so that as I, again, fall out, it's not the same color. It's like fading into some other colors. And I'm just doing some back and forth crisscross. Mainly just getting these softened. Okay. And then I'll introduce a little bit of phthalo up here and whiten that down pretty good bit too. So that way I can have a little more light and some of that phthalo. And you just keep adjusting and blending this until you get the brightness that you want. You can make it more white, you can make it more yellow, you know, whatever the case may be. Just let it be subtle. But the main thing is that, you know, there's a lot of light that tends to get put right around the subject matter. And I just happen to be running out of white, so I don't know that I'll get too much brighter around it, but try to put a little bit more just for some drama. The main thing is just to make it subtle. You know, if you have just a glob of white and you don't blend it in, it's really gonna, you know, be more distracting, I think. It would for me be more distracting. So I'm just trying to be more mindful of that. And just getting rid of my sharp edges so that they're blended in. So that whatever I put, I can just kind of call attention. All right, and that's it. This is our little kingfisher. So it's cute, almost looks like a hummingbird resting, right? So